A routine traffic stop turns into every officer's worst nightmare when Officer Darren Cole pulls over a suspicious sedan late at night. At first, everything seems normal, until he sees the terrified little girl in the back seat. Something is wrong. And when he checks his dashcam footage later, his blood runs cold. Watch until the end to uncover the chilling truth. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories. Officer Darren Cole had spent years patrolling the quiet streets of Cedar Grove, a small suburban town where trouble was rare. The hum of his cruiser's engine filled the stillness of the night, broken only by the occasional crackle of his radio. The clock on the dashboard read 9:17 p.m. An uneventful shift so far. He had learned, though, that quiet nights could turn chaotic in an instant. A pair of headlights flickered in the distance as a dark blue sedan rolled past a stop sign without even slowing. Darren sighed, flipping on his lights. Not a serious offense, but a stop sign was a stop sign. He wasn't about to let it slide. The sedan hesitated for a moment before pulling over to the side of the road. Darren parked behind it, his instincts kicking in as he ran through the possibilities. A distracted driver, someone coming home late from work, or maybe even a teenager pushing their luck. He grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Cole. Conducting a routine traffic stop, dark sedan, plate 7FZ314. No assistance needed at this time." The cool night air met him as he stepped out. His boots crunched against the pavement while he approached the driver's side window, senses sharp, scanning for anything out of place. The window rolled down smoothly. The driver was a man in his late 40s, dressed too neatly for the hour. Button-down shirt, slicked back hair, an air of forced calmness. He smiled, but something about it felt off. Too polished, too rehearsed. "Good evening, officer. Something wrong?" His voice was warm, but Darren noticed the way his fingers gripped the steering wheel, just a little too tight. Darren's eyes flicked to the back seat. A little girl sat there, clutching a stuffed rabbit so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. 6, maybe 7 years old, long brown hair, pale face. She was stiff, unnaturally so. When she forced a smile at him, it didn't reach her eyes. A quiet alarm went off in Darren's mind. "Evening," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "You ran a stop sign back there. Any reason for the rush?" The man let out a light chuckle, scratching the back of his head. "Oh, my apologies, officer. Long day, just trying to get home." "License and registration, please." "Of course," the man said smoothly, reaching into the glove compartment without hesitation and handing over the documents. "Name's Victor Lane, and this is my daughter Lily. We were at my sister's house for dinner, got a little late, and she's exhausted." Darren nodded, but his eyes were already back on the little girl. "Lily, huh?" he asked, watching her reaction. "You doing okay back there?" She hesitated. The answer seemed to catch in her throat before she finally whispered, "Yes, sir." Victor was quick to jump in. "She's just tired. You know how kids get." Darren didn't respond right away. His instincts were screaming at him. His flashlight flicked toward the back seat, scanning the interior. No bags, no toys, nothing that suggested a father traveling with his daughter. The only thing she had was that stuffed rabbit, and she clutched it like a lifeline. Then he saw it. Her fingers were trembling. A slow, creeping unease settled in Darren's chest. "Where's home?" he asked casually. "Just outside of town," Victor responded smoothly. "Over on Oak Ridge Drive." The answer came too quickly, too rehearsed. Darren glanced at the license. Victor Lane. Oak Ridge Drive. Everything checked out, on paper. But Darren had been doing this too long to ignore a gut feeling. He studied Victor closely. A sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead, despite the cool night air. His breathing was steady, but there was a flicker of tension in the way his jaw tightened. Something wasn't right. Darren shifted slightly, angling his body toward the car. He needed to push a little harder. "Lily," he said again, this time making direct eye contact. "How was dinner at your aunt's house?" The little girl froze for half a second, just long enough for Darren to notice. "It was good," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Victor let out a forced chuckle. "She's exhausted, officer. You know how kids get when they're tired." Darren's gaze dropped to Victor's arm as the man reached into the back seat, resting a hand lightly on Lily's shoulder. Lily flinched. The movement was so subtle that most people wouldn't have noticed, but Darren did. And it wasn't just surprise. It was fear. His stomach tightened. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. But instincts alone weren't enough to act on. Not yet. "All right, Mr. Lane," Darren said slowly, handing the license and registration back. "Just make sure you come to a complete stop at intersections. It's for everyone's safety." Victor took the documents with an easy smile. "Of course, officer. Won't happen again." Darren stepped back from the car, watching closely. He wanted to press further, to ask more questions, but without probable cause, there was nothing he could do. Not legally, at least. "You're free to go." Victor nodded, flashing another too-perfect smile. "You have a good night, officer." The sedan pulled away. Darren stood there, unmoving. The street was quiet again, but that gnawing feeling in his gut only grew stronger. Just before stepping into his cruiser, he hesitated. Then, without thinking, he pulled out his notebook and jotted down the license plate number. 7FZ34. He didn't know what was wrong yet, but he was damn sure he was going to find out. Darren sat in his patrol car, the engine idling as he stared down the empty road where Victor Lane's sedan had disappeared minutes ago. His gut told him something was wrong, but gut feelings weren't enough to make an arrest. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Come on, Cole. Think." His eyes drifted to the dashboard camera. A flicker of hope sparked in his chest. He reached over and rewound the last few minutes, playing back the moment he had approached the car. Victor's too polished demeanor. Lily's unnatural stillness. He fast-forwarded until he saw her face again. Then he saw it. Her lips moved. Darren's breath caught in his throat. He rewound the footage, slowing it down this time. Lily clutching her stuffed rabbit, her knuckles white, her lips forming two silent words. "Help me." A cold wave of realization crashed over Darren. He had just let a kidnapped child drive away. His pulse hammered as he grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Cole. I need an immediate APB on a dark blue sedan, plate 7FZ3114, possible child abduction. Suspect identified as Victor Lane, 40s, white male, slicked back hair, wearing a button-down. Victim is a young girl, brown hair, approximately 6 or 7 years old. Suspect is possibly armed and dangerous. I repeat, this is an urgent APB." The radio crackled. "Copy that, Officer Cole. Sending it out now. Do you have confirmation that this is an abduction?" Darren's grip tightened on the wheel. The child asked for help. That was all he needed. He threw the car into drive and sped down the road, scanning the streets. Victor had a 10-minute head start. If he was smart, he was already out of town. But Darren had a feeling he wasn't gone yet. 20 minutes later, at Cedar Grove Police Station, Darren pushed through the doors of the records room, his pulse still racing. An APB was out, but that wasn't enough. He needed to know who the hell Victor Lane really was. At the desk, Detective Sarah Blake glanced up from her computer screen. "You don't waste time, do you?" she muttered, clicking through her files. Sarah was sharp, no nonsense, and had a way of cutting through red tape when needed. If there was dirt on Victor, she would find it. "Victor Lane," Darren said, leaning over the desk. "I need everything you have on him." Sarah frowned. "That's weird. There's barely anything here. No criminal record, no prior arrests. The guy's a ghost." Darren clenched his jaw. "That's not possible. No one's a ghost." Sarah's fingers moved quickly over the keyboard. A few seconds later, her expression darkened. "Wait." Darren's pulse kicked up. "Found something. He changed his name 6 years ago. Used to be Gordon Lively. And under that name," she turned the monitor toward Darren, "he was questioned in 3 different states for suspicious behavior involving minors." Darren felt his blood run cold. Was he ever convicted? Sarah shook her head. No, he always managed to slip through the cracks, witnesses backing out, lack of solid evidence. But get this, she scrolled further. Wherever he was spotted, kids went missing. Darren's stomach twisted. He's not getting away this time. Darren scrolled through recent Amber Alerts, scanning for anything that matched Lily's description. Then he saw it. Lillian Carter, age 7. Brown hair, brown eyes. Reported missing 3 days ago from a park in Millbrook, 50 miles from here. He felt his chest tighten. "Sarah." His voice was tight. She turned, reading over his shoulder. "Damn it," she muttered. "That's her." Darren grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, we have a match to an active Amber Alert. Victim's name is Lillian Carter, kidnapped from Millbrook. Repeat, suspect Lane, aka Gordon Lively, is traveling with a kidnapped child. I need all available units on this now." "Copy that, Officer Cole. sending units to his last known location. Darren exhaled sharply, already moving toward the door. He wouldn't let her slip away again. He couldn't. Darren's cruiser tore through the streets of Cedar Grove, headlights slicing through the darkness. His mind raced faster than the engine. He had looked her in the eyes and let her disappear into the night with a monster. Come on, he muttered, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then his radio crackled. Cole, this is dispatch. We've got a possible sighting of your suspect's vehicle at a gas station off Route 6. Clerk says the driver seemed nervous, had a little girl with him. Darren's foot slammed on the gas. I'm en route. The gas station came into view, a lonely beacon of fluorescent light in the middle of an otherwise empty highway. Darren pulled in fast, tires screeching. He pushed through the doors, flashing his badge. The guy with the little girl, where is he? The clerk, a lanky kid barely out of high school, blinked at him. He left like 10 minutes ago. Filled up his tank, bought some snacks. The kid dropped her toy on the way out, and when she bent to pick it up, he snapped at her, called her stupid. Darren's stomach twisted. Did you see which way they went? Yeah, they turned onto Pine Street, headed south toward the highway. Darren was already sprinting back to his car. He threw it into drive and peeled out onto the road, his headlights cutting through the night. The further south he drove, the fewer options Victor had. If he was smart, he'd keep moving. But if he was panicked? Darren's gut told him Victor would need to stop soon. Then, through the trees, a flickering vacancy sign appeared. A rundown motel, barely standing, sitting just off the highway like a forgotten relic. Darren slowed, pulling into the lot. Only a few cars were scattered around, but one stood out, a dark blue sedan, parked near the last row of rooms. His breath caught. Found you. His radio crackled. Cole, this is Detective Sarah Blake. I'm 2 minutes out. You got eyes on the target? Darren didn't take his eyes off the motel room. Yeah, he whispered. He's here. The motel's neon vacancy sign buzzed weakly, casting flickering light onto the cracked pavement. The place looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Paint peeling from the walls, a handful of dimly lit rooms stretching along the lot. Darren stayed low, moving toward the sedan. The engine was still warm. Victor was here. His eyes flicked up to room 12, curtains slightly parted, a faint glow from inside. He could make out two silhouettes. One was pacing. Victor. The other sat still. Lily. His grip tightened around his gun. His radio crackled. Cole, this is Blake. We're pulling in now. Where's your position? Darren didn't take his eyes off the room. Room 12. He's inside with her. Hold position. We go in together. Darren's jaw clenched. They didn't have time. Inside the room, Victor's movements were quick, erratic, stuffing things into a bag. He wasn't planning to stay. If Darren waited too long, they could be gone before backup even got into place. His pulse pounded. Then the lights inside went out. His stomach dropped. Victor knew he was here. Darren moved fast, pressing himself against the wall beside the door, ears straining for any sound. A shuffle, a rustling, a door creaking open. Then, footsteps. Not from inside the room, from behind him. Darren spun just in time to see a shadow lunge out from the alley between buildings. A figure in dark clothing, hood pulled low. The glint of metal caught the dim light. A knife. Darren barely sidestepped the first slash. The blade grazed his sleeve, slicing through fabric. Too close. He reacted fast, grabbing the attacker's wrist and twisting hard. The man let out a sharp grunt but didn't let go. This wasn't Victor. This was someone else. Another player. Darren drove his knee into the attacker's ribs, forcing a pained wheeze. The man staggered, but before Darren could press the advantage, the motel door, room 12, screeched open. Darren's eyes flicked toward it for half a second. It was all his attacker needed. A fist crashed into Darren's side, knocking the breath from his lungs. He stumbled, vision swimming, but kept his footing. The man took off running, vanishing into the night before Darren could react. Damn it. Who the hell was that? But there was no time to think. Darren turned toward the motel room and saw Victor dragging Lily toward the bathroom. Victor. Darren barked, stepping into the doorway. The room was a mess. Bed unmade, fast food wrappers strewn across the nightstand. A duffel bag sat open near the door. Inside, Darren caught a glimpse of fake IDs, cash, a stolen passport. Victor had been planning this for a while, but all that mattered now was Lily. Victor's arm was wrapped tightly around the little girl, his hand gripping her wrist as he tried to yank her into the small motel bathroom. She didn't scream, didn't cry, but her eyes, they were wide with silent terror. Darren's gun was already drawn, aimed straight at Victor. "Let her go," he ordered, voice sharp. Victor's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape. There wasn't one. "You don't understand," Victor hissed, his voice cracking. "She's mine." "No, she's not." Darren took a slow step forward, gun steady. "Her name is Lillian Carter. She has parents who are looking for her. You stole her, Victor." Victor's grip tightened. Lily whimpered. Darren's heartbeat thundered in his ears. He had one shot to end this without Lily getting hurt. "You don't have a way out," Darren pressed, keeping his voice even. "The second you step outside, you're done. You know that." Victor's jaw clenched. He was unraveling. "Put the girl down." For the first time, Victor hesitated. Then, a shadow moved outside. Darren barely had time to register it before. The motel window shattered. Glass exploded inward, shards spraying across the room like deadly confetti. Darren instinctively ducked, keeping his gun locked on Victor. Someone had just shot out the window. But who? Victor didn't wait to find out. He yanked Lily forward, dragging her into the bathroom. Darren lunged, but Victor kicked the door shut. Hard. The frame splintered as the lock jammed in place. "Damn it!" Darren moved fast, slamming his shoulder into the door. No good. The motel was old, but the door was solid. Too solid. A low groan outside the window snapped his attention back. Darren turned just in time to see a figure, the same hooded man from before, scrambling away from the broken glass. The second attacker. "Freeze!" Darren barked, raising his weapon. The man hesitated just long enough for Darren to get a look at his face. Late 30s. Sharp cheekbones. Cold, calculating eyes. Not some random thug. This guy knew what he was doing. Then, before Darren could react, the man bolted. Darren cursed, torn between chasing him and getting to Lily. Lily. The hesitation lasted less than a second. Darren spun back to the bathroom door. He wasn't losing that girl again. "Victor." Darren pounded on the wood, his voice echoing. "You can't win this." Silence. Then, running water. Darren's stomach dropped. He's covering noise. He took a step back, squared his shoulders, and slammed his foot into the lock. The door frame shattered on impact. Darren burst inside, just in time to see Victor climbing out the tiny bathroom window, Lily slung over his shoulder. "No!" Darren surged forward, grabbing Victor by the leg. The older man kicked wildly, nearly knocking Darren off balance. Lily let out a strangled cry. Victor wasn't strong, but he was desperate. He thrashed, catching Darren in the jaw with his elbow. White-hot pain shot through Darren's skull. He lost his grip for half a second, and in that half-second, Victor slipped through. Darren stumbled forward, cursing as he watched Victor disappear into the woods behind the motel, Lily still in his arms. No, not again. He vaulted through the window, ignoring the glass that sliced his hands. The second his boots hit the dirt, he took off running. The woods swallowed them all whole. The woods were a black void, dense with twisted branches that clawed at the night sky. The damp earth muffled Darren's footsteps, but he could still hear Victor crashing through the underbrush ahead. And Lily. Her muffled sobs cut through the darkness, small and terrified. Darren pushed harder, his breath ragged, his boots sinking into the damp forest floor. Victor was slowing down. The weight of Lily, the uneven terrain, he wouldn't outrun Darren forever. "Victor?" Darren barked. "Let her go." No response. But then, a misstep. Up ahead, Victor stumbled, nearly losing his grip on Lily. The little girl kicked wildly, struggling in his arms. She wasn't giving up. Neither was Darren. Darren reached for his gun, then hesitated. A shot in the dark could hit Lily. He had to get closer. The chase twisted deeper into the forest, the trees pressing in from all sides. The moon barely pierced through the canopy, leaving only slivers of light. Darren kept his focus on Victor's silhouette, tracking every movement. The bastard was getting desperate. Then, a clearing up ahead, and beyond it, a river. Darren's stomach tightened. Victor was running straight for the water. "Don't do it, Lane," Darren shouted. Victor didn't stop. He burst into the clearing, sprinting toward the water's edge. Lily let out a shriek, kicking harder. Darren closed the gap, his legs burning. 5 feet. 4. Then, Victor leaped. He lunged into the river, gripping Lily tightly. The current caught them instantly, dragging them downstream. Shit. Darren didn't think. He ran straight after them, boots hitting the mud hard. He barely had a second to register how freezing cold the river was before he was underwater. The current ripped at Darren's body, pulling him down. He fought against it, breaking the surface, just in time to see Victor struggling further ahead. The bastard was flailing. He couldn't swim. But Lily could. She was kicking, pushing, trying to get away from him. Darren swam forward, fast. Victor was losing his grip. Lily slipped from his arms, her tiny frame pulled further away. Darren's muscles screamed, but he reached out, fingers closing around her wrist. "Got you." Lily clung to him, shivering, terrified. Darren turned toward the shore. If he could just... A hand grabbed his ankle. Cold, strong, desperate. "Victor." Darren kicked hard, his boots smashing against Victor's chest. The man sank beneath the surface, gasping, thrashing. For a second, Darren thought he'd resurface, that he'd fight back. But he didn't. The river swallowed him whole. Darren dragged Lily to the shore, collapsing onto the wet grass. His lungs burned. His limbs felt like lead. But she was safe. She curled into his chest, shaking. "I got you," Darren rasped. "You're okay. You're okay." The distant wail of sirens broke through the night. They had made it. They were going home. Darren sat on the back bumper of an ambulance, his uniform soaked and heavy, boots still caked in river mud. The flashing red and blue lights from patrol cars painted the wet grass in pulses of color. Across from him, Lily sat wrapped in a thick gray blanket, her small hands gripping her stuffed rabbit like a lifeline. She hadn't let go of it once. Detective Sarah Blake crouched beside her, speaking softly. Lily hadn't said a word since they pulled her from the river. Darren understood why. She'd been trapped in a nightmare for days, surrounded by strangers, afraid of making a sound. Silence had kept her safe, but now she was still trapped in it. Sarah stood, walking over to Darren. She crossed her arms, watching Lily for a second before speaking. "She okay?" Darren asked. Sarah sighed. "Physically, yeah. Paramedics say she's stable. Some bruises, signs of exhaustion. But mentally?" She shook her head. "That's gonna take time." Darren nodded, wiping a hand down his face. "And Lane?" he asked. Sarah's expression darkened. "Divers are searching downstream. No sign of a body yet." Darren wasn't surprised. The river's current was fast, brutal. It had swallowed Victor like a stone. But something in his gut nagged at him. Sarah must have sensed it because she gave him a look. "You really think he's dead?" Darren exhaled, staring at the dark water beyond the flashing lights. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm not betting on it." A female paramedic approached, kneeling beside Lily. She spoke gently, offering a cup of hot cocoa. Lily didn't react. Her grip on the stuffed rabbit never loosened. Sarah watched, frustration flickering in her eyes. "I hate this part. We save them, but it doesn't end for them, does it?" Darren had no answer. He could chase monsters into the dark. He could pull children out of hell, but he couldn't erase what had happened to them. And Lily? She wasn't just a victim. She was evidence. A black SUV pulled into the scene, slowing near the ambulances. A man in his late 40s, graying at the temples, stepped out. David Carter, Lily's father. His face was a mess of emotions, fear, exhaustion, hope, all tangled together. He barely heard the officer briefing him before his eyes landed on his daughter. "Lily?" She stiffened at the sound. Then slowly she turned. The moment her wide, brown eyes met his, the dam broke. "Daddy!" David rushed forward, dropping to his knees. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her so tightly it was like he was afraid she'd disappear again. Lily clung to him, sobbing into his chest. Darren looked away, giving them the moment. Sarah exhaled, her own eyes damp. "Damn," she muttered. "I needed that." Darren just nodded. For the first time that night, he let himself breathe. The reunion was short-lived. The uniformed officer approached Darren, voice low, urgent. "We found something." Darren's stomach tightened. "What is it?" The officer held up a plastic evidence bag. Inside was a black leather notebook, its cover scuffed and worn. "Where was this?" Darren asked. "Hidden in Lane's duffel bag. Looks like some kind of ledger." Darren frowned, flipping it open. Names, dates, locations. His stomach twisted as he scanned the entries. Some names had check marks next to them. Others had numbers, payment amounts. Sarah looked over his shoulder. Her face went pale. Jesus Christ. This wasn't just a kidnapping. This was a trafficking operation. Lily hadn't just been taken by some sick bastard acting alone. She was part of something bigger. And worse, she wasn't the first. Darren exhaled sharply. "We need to cross-check these names. If even one of them matches a missing persons report." "They will," Sarah cut in. You know they will. Darren's fingers tightened around the plastic evidence bag. The list was too long. Too many names. Too many victims. Victor Lane might be dead, but his operation wasn't. Darren's jaw clenched. This isn't over. Sarah's eyes darkened. Then we finish it. The precinct was eerily quiet at this hour. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting a dim glow over stacks of case files and half-empty coffee cups. Darren sat at his desk, the black ledger lying open in front of him. Page after page of names, check marks, dates, payment amounts. It felt endless. He had spent the last 2 hours cross-referencing each entry against missing persons reports. Too many matched. Too many kids like Lily. Too many parents still waiting for children who would never come home. His jaw clenched. This wasn't just Victor Lane. This was a network, a carefully constructed operation built to snatch children off the streets and sell them like commodities. And tonight, by sheer luck, Darren had ripped a hole in it. Now, he was going to burn the whole damn thing to the ground. I found something. Sarah's voice pulled Darren out of his thoughts. She strode toward his desk, dropping a file onto the growing pile of evidence. Darren opened it, scanning the first page. A name jumped out at him. Mark Ridley. Who's this? He asked. The motel manager, Sarah said. Took off an hour before we raided the place. Darren narrowed his eyes. He ran? Sarah nodded. Yeah, which means he knew what was happening in room 12. I checked his financials. He's been getting steady payments from an offshore account. Money wired in every month. Same source. Darren's pulse kicked up. Victor's operation was bigger than just a few lowlifes. They had funding, infrastructure, people in the right places willing to keep their mouths shut. Where is he now? No idea, but I put out a bolo. If he's still in town, we'll find him. Darren exhaled sharply, fingers drumming against the desk. Mark Ridley wasn't a mastermind. He was a piece, a cog in the machine. But if they got to him first, I want him alive, Darren said. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. Yeah, me too. The precinct was nearly empty by the time Darren finally stood, stretching the tension from his shoulders. The exhaustion was creeping in, but his mind wouldn't stop. He turned to leave, then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. Darren frowned, answering cautiously. Hey. Silence. Then, a low voice. You should walk away from this. Darren's entire body tensed. Who is this? He demanded, a soft chuckle. Cold, unbothered. You think you've done something tonight? You haven't. You just made yourself a problem. Darren's grip on the phone tightened. Listen to me, you sick son of a... There are more children than you can count. More than you'll ever save. And if you don't stop, we'll take one right from under your nose. A chill stabbed through Darren's spine. Consider this your only warning. Click. The line went dead. Darren stood there, his heartbeat a war drum in his ears, his fists clenched, his teeth ground together. For the first time all night, rage outweighed exhaustion. They thought they could scare him. They just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The weight of the threat pressed down on Darren's chest as he sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel. The distorted voice on the phone still echoed in his head. We'll take one right from under your nose. This wasn't just about Victor Lane anymore. This was bigger. Darren had spent years chasing criminals, but this was an organization. A machine. And now they knew his name. His hands curled into fists. They thought they could scare him? They just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Darren stormed back into the precinct, the fluorescent lights buzzing above him. The place was quieter at this hour, most desks empty, but Sarah was still there, leaning over her computer, flipping through files. She looked up the second he entered. What happened? She asked, reading the tension in his face. Darren tossed his phone onto the desk. They called me. Sarah's expression darkened. Shit. Yeah, she pressed her lips into a thin line. What did they say? Darren exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. They know we're coming after them, and they're not just gonna run. They're gonna fight back. Sarah leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. You think this was just a scare tactic? Darren shook his head. No, this was a warning. And when people like them warn you, it's because they think you're a threat. Sarah sat up straighter. Then let's make sure they're right. They spent the next hour digging through Victor's ledger, matching names against missing persons reports, hunting for patterns. The deeper they went, the worse it got. Sarah clicked through transaction records, her eyes narrowing. This money isn't coming from small-time criminals. Look at these amounts. These are six-figure payments. Someone up the food chain is bankrolling this. Darren studied the pages in front of him. Names, dates, destinations. Then, a familiar one caught his eye. Pier 17. His pulse kicked up. Pier 17? Sarah read over his shoulder. You thinking what I'm thinking? Darren grabbed his jacket. I think it's time we paid a visit. 1:45 a.m. Pier 17. The docks were practically deserted, save for a few cargo ships anchored offshore. The air smelled of salt and rust, the faint sound of water slapping against the pier, the only noise cutting through the stillness. Darren and Sarah moved through the shadows, keeping low as they approached an old warehouse. The address from Victor's ledger matched exactly. Think we'll find anything? Sarah whispered. Darren's gut told him yes. They reached the side of the building, pressing against the metal siding. Darren peeked through a dirty window, rows of crates stacked high, dim lights casting long shadows. Then, movement. Two men in dark clothing talking near the far side of the warehouse, armed. Darren and Sarah exchanged a look. This wasn't just a storage facility. This was a hub. Sarah pulled out her phone, snapping quick pictures through the glass. We need backup, she whispered. Darren nodded, but before he could reach for his radio, a voice rang out. Hey! They'd been spotted. One of the men reached for his gun. Move! Darren hissed, shoving Sarah toward cover as a gunshot split the night. They dove behind a stack of crates as more gunfire erupted, bullets tearing through wooden planks. Shit! Sarah gasped, pulling her own weapon. We're pinned! Darren gritted his teeth. They had walked straight into a trap. The gunfire ripped through the wooden crates, splinters flying as Darren pressed himself against the stack. The air smelled of salt and gunpowder, the echoes of each shot bouncing off the metal walls of the warehouse. Sarah crouched beside him, breathing hard. We need to move. Darren peeked around the edge, two men, maybe more, shifting positions behind the cargo. They weren't amateurs. They moved with precision, cutting off escape routes. A bullet smacked into the crate inches from his head. He flinched back. They're trying to pin us down. Sarah's jaw clenched. Then let's not stay pinned. She leaned out, squeezing off two shots. One man ducked, the other returned fire. Darren scanned their surroundings. A metal stairwell led up to a catwalk that stretched across the warehouse. If they could get the high ground, they'd have a shot at evening the odds. He nudged Sarah. Stairs, 12 o'clock. She nodded. Reel over me. Darren fired twice, forcing the gunman into cover. Sarah sprinted, boots slamming against the floor as she made for the stairs. A burst of automatic fire followed her, punching holes through the rusted metal railing. She stumbled but kept going. Darren waited for the shooter to reload, then broke from cover, chasing after her. Another shot rang out, missing his shoulder by inches. He felt the heat of it pass. His heart pounded, breath sharp as he cleared the last steps, joining Sarah on the catwalk. Below, the men were repositioning. One of them pulled a radio from his belt. Darren didn't need to hear it to know what was happening. Reinforcements. Sarah swore under her breath. We need to end this now. She raised her gun, took aim, and fired. The man with the radio jerked backward, the device clattering to the ground. The other turned and bolted, disappearing behind a stack of cargo. Silence stretched across the warehouse. Darren exhaled, scanning the floor. You think that's all of them? Probably not. Sarah's voice was tight. But we stopped them from calling in more. Darren's eyes flicked to the far end of the warehouse, where a row of crates stood stacked higher than the rest. Something about them looked different, more secured. Come on. He moved, Sarah close behind. They climbed down another stairwell, weapons still raised. As they reached the crates, Darren noticed fresh shipping labels, marked with only a single insignia, an unfamiliar emblem, like a brand or a crest. Sarah ran her fingers over the crate's edge. This wasn't here long. Someone was expecting a delivery. Darren spotted a crowbar nearby, snatching it up. With a grunt, he wedged it under the lid and pried. The nails screeched as the wood gave way. Then he saw what was inside. He felt his stomach turn. Sarah sucked in a sharp breath. Jesus. Inside the crate, neatly stacked in rows, were files, hundreds of them. Folders, documents, photographs, names, children. Darren reached in, grabbing a handful of papers. Each file contained a picture of a child, details of their height, weight, and last known location. Some were missing person reports that had been in circulation for months. Others he had never seen before. Sarah flipped through one of the folders, her hands trembling. This isn't just a smuggling operation. It's a damn catalog. Darren clenched his jaw. They weren't moving product. He held up a file, the photo of a 10-year-old girl staring back at him. They were moving people. A noise behind them. Darren spun just as the man from before, the one who had run, emerged from the shadows, gun raised. Sarah was faster. Her shot cracked through the air. The man crumpled, his gun skidding across the floor. Darren stepped over the body, nudging the weapon away. His pulse was still hammering, but there was no time to process. Sarah exhaled shakily. We need to get this out of here. Darren nodded, stuffing as many files as he could into his jacket. And we need to find out who the hell is behind it. A distant sound cut through the silence, the wail of sirens. Sarah glanced at him. You call that in? He shook his head. No. She frowned. Then who the hell did? Darren didn't answer, because whoever had called the cops might not be on their side. And if this operation had police in their pocket, they were already running out of time. The wail of sirens grew louder, their flashing lights casting distorted shadows against the warehouse walls. Darren's grip on the stolen files tightened as he exchanged a wary glance with Sarah. Backup? She asked. Voice low. Darren shook his head. I didn't call it in. Sarah swore under her breath. Then we need to move. Now. They sprinted toward the side exit, keeping low as they wove between crates. Darren could hear the engines now, multiple vehicles, closing fast. He didn't know if it was the real police or someone else, but he wasn't about to stick around to find out. Sarah reached the door first, cracking it open just enough to see outside. The lot was already swarming with black SUVs, their tinted windows concealing whoever was inside. Darren's stomach twisted. This isn't CPD, Sarah muttered. Before Darren could respond, the warehouse was suddenly flooded with blinding white light, spotlights mounted on the SUVs snapping to life, cutting through the darkness like blades. A voice boomed through a loudspeaker. Drop your weapons and step out with your hands up. Darren froze. The voice was familiar, too familiar. Sarah's brows knit together. That's Captain Ross. Darren's jaw clenched. His captain? Here? Something wasn't right. He peeked through the cracked door, watching as uniformed officers and men in tactical gear began to spread out across the lot. Ross stood at the center of it all, his expression unreadable beneath the harsh lights. A bad feeling coiled in Darren's gut. They knew we'd be here, he murmured. Sarah stiffened beside him. You think Ross is in on this? Darren didn't answer. He didn't have to. Ross lifted his radio. I won't say it again. Come out, now. Darren weighed his options. If Ross was clean, they could explain. But if he wasn't, if he was part of this, then stepping outside unarmed would be suicide. His fingers hovered over his gun. Sarah noticed. Don't. We don't win in a shootout. She was right. They were outnumbered, outgunned. If they wanted to get out alive, they had to be smart. Darren's mind raced. There was only one way out now. He flipped open his phone, quickly snapping pictures of the files in his hand, each name, each face, each damning piece of evidence. Then he sent them. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen. You just texted me? Not just you. Darren's voice was steady. Every trusted contact I have. If we don't walk out of here, this doesn't disappear with us. Sarah's lips parted in understanding. Then she nodded. Okay, now what? Darren took a breath. We walk out, but we don't go down easy. She exhaled sharply. Let's do this. Together, they pushed open the door and stepped into the light. The moment they emerged, rifles snapped toward them. A dozen red dots danced across their chests. Darren kept his hands just high enough to show he wasn't a threat, but not so high that he looked weak. Beside him, Sarah did the same. Ross took a step forward, eyes cold. Officer Cole, Detective Blake, you've been busy. Darren held his stare. So have you, apparently. Ross ignored the jab. You were told to stand down. You told us to follow the evidence. Darren's voice was calm, but his pulse hammered. We did. Ross exhaled, shaking his head. You don't know what you've stepped into. Then why don't you enlighten us? Silence stretched between them. Then Ross sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose like this was just another inconvenience. Finally, he spoke. Take them. The men closed in. Darren clenched his fists as zip ties were tightened around his wrists. Sarah was hauled away beside him, her jaw tight, but but her eyes burning with defiance. As they were shoved toward the SUVs, Darren glanced at Ross one last time. The captain's expression was almost sad, like he knew something Darren didn't, like he knew this was far from over. Darren sat in the back of the SUV, wrists bound in zip ties, the city lights flashing past the tinted windows. Sarah was next to him, her breathing steady but sharp, like she was counting each second. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. This wasn't a standard arrest. No one had read them their rights. No radio chatter had gone out. This was off the books. The SUV took a hard left, tires screeching slightly against wet pavement. Darren stole a glance out the window. They weren't heading toward the precinct. Sarah noticed too. Where the hell are they taking us? Darren didn't answer. He already had a feeling. After another 15 minutes of silence, the SUV slowed, pulling into an underground garage. Dim fluorescent lights flickered above as they passed row after row of unmarked vehicles. The moment they stopped, the doors were yanked open. Strong hands gripped Darren's arms, hauling him out onto the concrete. He stumbled slightly but caught himself. Sarah was pulled out next, her eyes already scanning for exits. Then Captain Ross stepped into view. Darren squared his shoulders. So, are you going to tell us what the hell is going on, or do we have to guess? Ross didn't answer right away. Instead, he nodded at one of the men in tactical gear. Cut them loose. A knife flicked against the zip ties, freeing Darren's wrists. He flexed his fingers, resisting the urge to swing. Sarah shook her hands out, stepping closer to Darren, her stance tense. Ross sighed, rubbing his temples. You two really don't know when to quit. Not when there are kids involved, Darren shot back. Ross's jaw tightened. You think you're helping Cole? You think busting into that warehouse and poking the hornet's nest was a smart move? Darren took a step forward. Yeah, I do, because now we know the truth. Ross's eyes darkened. You don't know shit. Sarah scoffed. We know enough. The warehouse was a processing hub. Those files, they were records of every child trafficked through that operation. Ross exhaled through his nose, crossing his arms. And what exactly do you think you're going to do with that information? Darren's fists clenched. Expose it. For a second, Ross almost looked amused. Then his expression hardened. You're in over your heads. Darren narrowed his eyes. So what is this then? A warning? A chance to back off? Ross didn't answer right away. He glanced at Sarah, then back at Darren. You don't understand how deep this runs. You're dealing with people who don't just disappear when you slap a pair of cuffs on them. They own judges, politicians, people inside the department. Sarah's expression darkened. Are you saying you're one of them? Ross's lips pressed into a thin line. I'm saying I pick my battles. Darren took another step forward. Kids are missing, Ross. Kids like Lily. Are you telling me that's not a battle worth fighting? Something flickered in Ross's eyes. For the first time, hesitation. Then he sighed, reaching into his jacket. Darren tensed, ready for anything, until Ross pulled out a flash drive. He held it up between his fingers. This has everything, he said, voice low. Names, transactions, dates, more than what you found at the warehouse. Sarah frowned. Why give it to us? Ross's jaw tightened. Because I can't do anything with it. If I try, it disappears, just like people do when they get too close. Darren's pulse kicked up. And what happens when they find out you gave this to us? Ross's gaze didn't waver. That's not your concern. Darren reached for the flash drive. Ross didn't pull away, but just before he let go, he said, They'll come for you. Darren met his eyes. Let them. Ross nodded once. Then he stepped back, signaling to his men. Take them back. Make it look real. Before Darren could react, a fist crashed into his gut. Air whooshed from his lungs as he doubled over. He barely had time to recover before a second blow sent him to the concrete. He could hear Sarah cursing, struggling against them, but she wasn't faring any better. The last thing Darren saw before everything went dark, Ross walking away, leaving them to take the fall. Darren sat on the cold metal bench, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Sarah paced the length of the cell, arms crossed, frustration rolling off her in waves. We need to get out of here, she muttered. Darren nodded. We will. Sarah stopped, shooting him a sharp look. Yeah? How? Because unless you've got a key hidden somewhere, we're sitting ducks. Darren exhaled through his nose. Ross? Sarah frowned. You think he'll help us? He gave us that flash drive. He didn't have to. He's in deep, but he's not all the way gone. Darren leaned back against the cold wall. If he wanted us dead, we'd be dead. Sarah didn't argue. Footsteps approached. The heavy click of boots against concrete. Then the cell door swung open. Ross stepped inside, his face unreadable. Behind him, 2 uniformed officers stood silent, eyes forward. "You really screwed up, Cole," Ross said, voice low. Darren smirked. "That what Ashford told you?" Ross's expression darkened. "You don't get it, do you?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "There are rules in this game, and you two just broke them." Sarah folded her arms. "So what now? You going to make us disappear too?" Ross sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked exhausted. "If I wanted you gone, you wouldn't be standing here." Darren's gaze sharpened. "Then why are you here?" Ross didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned to the officers behind him. "Turn the cameras off." The 2 men hesitated, then obeyed, flipping the switches on the wall. The red recording light blinked off. Sarah's hands curled into fists. "You better not be about to screw us over, Ross." He exhaled sharply. "I'm getting you out of here." Darren and Sarah exchanged a look. "Why?" Darren asked. Ross's jaw tightened. "Because I've been looking the other way for too damn long. And because Ashford is right about one thing. This doesn't end with him. If you two go after him now, you won't make it." Darren stood slowly. "Then what do you suggest?" Ross's expression hardened. "You disappear. Stay off the grid. You take that flash drive and use it the right way. Press, FBI, someone who can't be bought." Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "And you think they won't see us coming? You've already made yourselves targets. They won't stop hunting you." Ross pulled something from his pocket. "A key card. But I can buy you a head start." Darren eyed him carefully. "And what about you?" Ross hesitated. "If they find out I helped you, I'm dead." A beat of silence. Sarah exhaled. "Then let's make sure they don't find out." Ross handed Darren the key card. "Service exit, 3rd floor. You've got 10 minutes before the shift change." Darren took it. "Appreciate it, Captain." Ross's lips pressed into a thin line. "Just don't make me regret it." Sarah smirked. "No promises." Ross shook his head, stepping aside. "Get the hell out of here." Darren and Sarah didn't waste another second. Darren and Sarah moved quickly, keeping their heads down as they slipped through the dimly lit corridors of the precinct. The key card Ross had given them worked exactly as promised, unlocking doors that should have been off-limits. Their boots barely made a sound against the polished floors. 3rd floor. Service exit. 10 minutes. Darren kept his eyes sharp, checking corners before they turned. If anyone spotted them now, the entire building would be on lockdown. Sarah exhaled quietly beside him. "This feels too easy." "It's not," Darren muttered. "It just means we haven't hit the hard part yet." They reached the final door, a metal exit leading into the parking garage. Darren swiped the keycard. The light blinked green. Sarah exhaled. "I can't believe that actually worked." The door clicked open. They stepped through into the cold night air and walked straight into a gun. A man in a black suit stood beside an unmarked car, silencer already attached to his weapon. His expression was unreadable, his stance calm, professional. Darren barely had time to react before the man pulled the trigger. A gunshot rang out. For a split second, Darren thought he was dead. Then the man staggered, a fresh wound blooming in his shoulder. Sarah stood beside him, gun raised. She had fired first. "Move," she barked. Darren didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, slamming into the gunman, wrestling for control of the weapon. The man was fast, trained, but Darren fought dirtier. He drove an elbow into the man's ribs, then twisted the gun from his grip. Sarah stepped in, knocking him unconscious with the butt of her pistol. Darren's breath came fast. They were waiting. Sarah wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Yeah, well, screw their plans." Darren turned, scanning the garage. They needed a vehicle, fast. Then he spotted it. A black Dodge Charger, keys still in the ignition. He pointed. "There." They sprinted to the car, throwing the doors open. Darren took the driver's seat, Sarah barely slamming the door shut before he peeled out of the garage. The moment they hit the street, headlights flashed behind them. More SUVs, more men. Sarah exhaled sharply. Of course they have backup. Darren tightened his grip on the wheel. "Hold on." He punched the gas. The Charger roared forward, tearing through the dark streets of Cedar Grove. The engine roared as Darren swerved onto the highway, the Charger's tires screeching against the asphalt. The black SUVs were close behind, their headlights cutting through the dark like predatory eyes. Sarah checked the side mirror, cursing under her breath. They're gaining. Darren didn't look. He already knew. The bastards were fast, well-funded, well-trained, and relentless. They're not trying to arrest us, he said grimly. Sarah reloaded her gun. No shit, they want us gone. Darren clenched his jaw. Not happening. He spotted an on-ramp to an industrial district, leading to a maze of old warehouses and shipping yards. No cameras, no witnesses. A perfect place to disappear, or a perfect place to die. Darren took the exit. The moment they left the main road, the SUV spread out, trying to flank them. Sarah turned, bracing herself against the seat. You got a plan? Working on it. Work faster. The first SUV swung to their right, trying to box them in. Sarah leaned out the window, firing 2 shots. The windshield cracked, but the driver kept coming. The second SUV pulled up on their left. Darren's eyes flicked between the mirrors, calculating. Then he slammed the brakes. The Charger skidded violently, tires screaming. The SUVs didn't have time to react. They shot past them, momentarily overshooting their target. Darren punched the gas again. Buy me a few seconds. Sarah fired at the SUV behind them, hitting a tire. The vehicle veered left, smashing into a concrete barrier. Sparks exploded as metal crumpled. One down, Sarah muttered. The other 2 weren't stopping. Darren's mind raced. They needed to level the playing field. He spotted an abandoned construction site ahead, a half-built overpass surrounded by scaffolding and heavy machinery. It gave him an idea. A stupid idea. Sarah saw it too. Don't even think about it. Darren didn't answer, because he was already thinking about it. The gap between the unfinished overpass was at least 20 feet. No normal driver would risk it. But Darren wasn't a normal driver. He locked eyes with Sarah. Trust me, she exhaled sharply. I hate you. Then she grabbed the oh shit handle. Darren floored it. The Charger hurtled toward the gap, speed climbing past 80. The unfinished ramp loomed ahead, a leap into either escape or death. The SUVs weren't backing off. They didn't think he'd do it. They were wrong. The Charger launched off the edge. For a split second, everything went silent. No tires against pavement, no roaring engines, just the weightless, gut-wrenching moment between life and impact. Then, the car slammed down. The suspension buckled, metal groaning, but the Charger held. Darren barely had time to breathe before one of the SUVs tried to follow. It wasn't fast enough. The front wheels caught the edge, but the back end didn't make it. The SUV tilted, its weight dragging it backward. Darren and Sarah watched as it plunged off the edge, flipping midair before crashing into the ground below. A fireball erupted. Sarah let out a breath. That's 2 down. The final SUV skidded to a stop on the other side of the gap. For the first time, their pursuers hesitated. Darren smirked. Didn't think so. Without another word, he sped into the night, leaving them behind. The city lights blurred past as Darren pushed the Charger toward the outskirts of Cedar Grove. The adrenaline was still coursing through his veins, but he knew they weren't safe yet, not even close. Sarah checked the mirror for the 100th time. No sign of them. Think they gave up? Darren's grip tightened on the wheel. No, they're just regrouping. She exhaled sharply, slumping back into the seat. We need a plan, a real one. We can't keep running forever. Darren's eyes flicked to the glove compartment. Inside was the flash drive Ross had given them, the one filled with names, transactions, and proof of everything Ashford and his network had been doing. This is our plan, he said, tapping the dashboard. We expose them. Sarah let out a dry laugh. And who exactly do we trust with it? Ross is compromised. The department is compromised. Hell, for all we know, half the damn justice system is in Ashford's pocket. Darren didn't answer right away. She was right. But there was one option left. We don't go to them, he said. We go to the public. Sarah frowned. You mean leak it? Darren nodded. News outlets, independent journalists, people who can't be bought. We put it out there, and we let the world see the truth before Ashford can cover it up. Sarah considered for a moment, then nodded. All right, but we need a safe place to do it. Darren's mind raced. Nowhere in Cedar Grove was safe anymore. But there was one place outside of town where they could disappear for a few hours. I know a place. The small cabin sat deep in the woods, hidden beneath a canopy of towering pines. It belonged to Darren's old academy instructor, a man who had retired years ago and left behind everything, including modern technology. No security cameras, no digital footprints. Perfect. Sarah booted up the laptop, inserting the flash drive. Darren stood behind her, watching as file after file loaded onto the screen. "Jesus," she murmured, "this is worse than I thought. Every transaction, every child taken, every dirty cop, politician, and businessman involved. It was all there." Sarah's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "All right, who do we send it to first?" Before Darren could answer, the power cut out. The cabin was plunged into darkness. Darren's pulse spiked. Sarah swore, grabbing her gun. "They found us." Darren moved to the window, peeking through the blinds. Shadows moved between the trees. At least 4 men, maybe more. No headlights, no sirens. They wanted this quiet. Sarah moved beside him. "Guess we're not done running." Darren's jaw clenched. "No." He reached for his phone, fingers flying across the screen. He hit send. The files uploaded. The truth was out. He turned to Sarah. "Now, we fight." The first shot shattered the cabin window. Darren ducked, grabbing his weapon. The night erupted in gunfire. Sarah returned fire, dropping one of the attackers. 2 on the left. Darren swung around, firing through the broken window. 1 man went down. The other dived for cover. Boots thudded against the porch. The door exploded inward. Darren didn't hesitate. He tackled the first man through the door, slamming him into the ground. Sarah fired, taking out another. 3 down. A fist caught Darren in the ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. He gritted his teeth, swinging hard, his fist colliding with the attacker's jaw. The man stumbled, then dropped. Sarah turned, gun still raised. "That all of them?" Darren listened. Silence. Then, the faint buzz of a phone vibrating. One of the dead men's phones lit up. Darren picked it up, eyes narrowing. A message. "Too late," Sarah frowned. "What does that mean?" Then, the cabin's landline rang. The sound was deafening in the quiet. Darren and Sarah exchanged a look. Darren picked up. A voice he knew too well spoke on the other end. "Officer Cole, I was hoping we could have a civilized conversation." Ashford. Darren's grip tightened. "Too late for that." A low chuckle. "No, Darren. Too late for you." The hairs on Darren's neck stood up. Then he heard it. Engines. Darren spun toward the window. SUVs. Blacked out. At least 6 of them. Sarah cursed. They brought the whole damn army. Darren turned back to the phone. "You're scared." Ashford's voice remained calm. "I don't get scared. I eliminate problems." Darren smirked. "Then you're really gonna hate this next part." He hit speakerphone. Sarah held up her own phone. Recording. Ashford realized too late. His voice was already out there, admitting everything. Darren exhaled, his pulse slowing. "You just confessed, Ashford. The whole world's gonna hear it." Silence. Then, for the first time, Ashford sounded human. "You son of a..." Darren hung up. Sarah let out a breathless laugh. "We actually did it." Darren glanced at the approaching SUVs. "Not yet." Sarah's eyes flicked to the tree line. "The river's a mile west. If we move now..." Darren nodded. "Go." They sprinted into the woods, disappearing into the dark. Behind them, the world was already burning.